Welcome to the Assembling Inclusion podcast. On this show, we feature different programs, individuals, and initiatives focused on being more inclusive of individual needs. We invite you to learn right alongside us. If you want some additional resources or access to our courses, please visit our website or follow us on social media. But for right now, let's get right to the episode. In this episode, we're talking to Dr. Coral Ho, a linguistic expert and the co-founder of Dysolve. Dr. Ho sheds a light on some of the limitations of scattered assessments and offers a groundbreaking solution. Dysolve utilizes over 30 years of research as well as gamified artificial intelligence to pinpoint the root causes of dyslexia in each student, paving the way for faster, more effective interventions and improved learning outcomes. So let's dive right in to learn more about Dysolve from Dr. Ho. Welcome back to the Assembly Inclusion podcast. Today we are joined by Dr. Coral Ho, a linguistic expert and co-founder of Dysolve, an edtech solution that's really going to transform how educators can address learning disabilities like dyslexia. So Dr. Ho, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Katie.
So I know we're going to dive right into talking about Dysolve and the different work being done, but I always like to start back at the beginning. What was your inspiration for creating or co-founding Dysolve? Were there specific challenges that you were really trying to overcome in the area of dyslexia support?
Yes, this goes back almost 30 years because after getting my PhD in linguistics, I wanted to help children in the community and also adults, and they came to me with all sorts of language conditions. Some of them have labels like dyslexia, but many of them don't. And, at first it was just community service. I was just helping people in the neighborhood. And then I realized that, there's this thing called dyslexia. And I came across it because a friend actually told me that her son was having trouble with reading in school. Then I asked, what she's going to do about it. And she said, oh, I have to have him evaluated. I said, what does that mean? And she said she's got to pay for an external specialist for $2,000 to just evaluate him for reading. And I was thinking, that's a lot of money. And so why don't you just let me do it for free? And let's just see what we can find out. All right, after all, I have this background in linguistics. So I designed the test myself. And I could see what the problem was, that he had trouble with vowels. But at that point, I didn't know how to correct it. So I started reading up on dyslexia, and I found that nobody knew how to correct the condition. And then when I looked at more and more students with dyslexia, I realized that this is a very complex condition. And so there are three factors we have to overcome. One is complexity, right? Because as we go deeper into the brain and look at the linguistic system, that is used for processing language input and then producing some kind of language output is super complex. And therefore, you can't have a human do it, because what dyslexia is really processing inefficiencies in the linguistic system in the brain. And these inefficiencies are scattered all over the place in this very complex system for different people. So you're not talking about particular spots. It could be anywhere in these billions and billions of data points in the system, right? So that's a complexity problem. The other problem is processing speed, because we do know that some students have processing speed issues, and that's why they have language problems, and then they may show up with reading problems. So how do you deal with language processing? Well, a human cannot do it in terms of recording it and then recalibrating it to make it faster and faster, because we're talking about under a second, right? A lot of these processes happen in hundreds of milliseconds. So how can humans do that for evaluating and then correcting it for intervention? The third problem is capacity. I can do it one-on-one with a student, but I do not think like a computer. So I cannot remember exactly the outputs of a student, say 2 months ago or 3 months ago. But, for an intervention program, it has to run for a while, at least 1 year, say. And so, even if I were to do it with just one student, I'm doing it very inefficiently, very imperfectly. I'll probably do like one test and tell the student to come back in a week or a month while I figure out what the next one is going to be, because I've got to look at all these data points. So I realized very early that we have to go to technology, and that's why we went for AI. And it took us 10 years to develop the whole AI platform for dyslexia.
I can so connect to the description that you gave of how inefficient it is to really by hand, as you know, as a human, go through and track all those data points. I struggled so much as a teacher with trying to manage my reading intervention students who
Mhm.
most of them had dyslexia or a specific learning disability, and trying to pinpoint all those data points and plan the personalized lessons and reassess them and figure out where they are. It is very overwhelming. So I was very excited when I had read about your program, because I was like, anything to make it more efficient and more effective has to be amazing to the classroom.
That's right, Katie. And, we want to have this conversation with teachers because, there's this incredible pressure on them to produce results when it's the method that is the problem, right? And then teachers hesitate to say there's something wrong with the method because I'm doing it with high fidelity and, it's still the same poor outcome year after year, but it's not the teacher's fault. It's not something that's supposed to be done by humans. And so it's really a problem when there are these larger bodies pushing it on individual teachers to produce the results. And so we have this problem where teachers cannot just come forward and say what they're seeing in the front lines, in the classroom. So it's really, really refreshing when we do hear it from the teachers saying, it's not working. It's not us. We're doing it with high fidelity and it is not working. And it's not supposed to work because it cannot be done by humans, right? There are some problems that are so complex that you have to turn to technology. And, it's great that we're at this stage where we can have this kind of AI programs to do what humans cannot do. Teachers do very well with the things they are supposed to do, which is to teach skills, right? Teach content, bond with the students so they feel motivated to learn, right? And give them that kind of very positive learning environment. But where we are going with Dysolve AI is to tackle where the gap is, because humans cannot get to this very deep level of brain processing, right? And schools have not been able to get to that stage. So that's why, we have student after student struggling year after year. But once we get this very deep level of brain processing corrected, then teachers come in to teach the skills, and they do not have to do more than what they do for typically developing children. And that's the way it should be. You correct the condition so that the students are no longer struggling, unlike their same age peers. So we get them to that stage, and then you find that, wow, they can really, really run now, right? And it's not a big effort then for the skills instruction and also for the content. So we think about it as 3 tiers. The first tier is brain processing. And up till now, without this AI program, we've never been able to get to that level to make a difference for students.
And I want to dive into the specifics of the computer piece a little bit, because this really is pairing my two great loves, which is special education and technology. So I'm very excited to talk to you about the technology piece too. I had read that Dissolve was one of the is the only computer-based program for dyslexia and different language disorders. I want to talk to you about specifically how Dissolve's approach differs from a traditional evaluation assessment. We talked about it a little bit, but just for our listeners who may not be as familiar, some of them are, on the front lines with dyslexia right now. Some of them are not. So, how does the approach, especially with the technology piece, different from a traditional evaluation that's done in schools?
Yes, and this is a hot topic right now, right, Katie? As you know, right? Because in different states, they have either passed or are going to pass laws on dyslexia screeners. But if you stand back from, being too involved in this problem, but just look at it as an outsider, right? If you think, okay, they're going to evaluate the students somehow, and they're going to get results from the evaluation or screening. And then I would imagine that they would use those results to inform or guide intervention. Better still, what if the screening results form the blueprints for intervention, so you don't waste time or effort? But that's not the case right now. All these dyslexia screeners just give some indication that there's a risk. But I think teachers and parents already know that there is a risk with some students. You suspect that because you're putting in all that effort to try to get them to read, and they cannot read, or they resist, or then there are all sorts of behavioral problems, right? So you already suspect that there is a problem. And for older students, because they're going through regular reading assessments and state testing, you know that they're failing. So that doesn't help to have that kind of screener. And also then, for some of them, again, teachers have to do the effort of learning how to administer. More training, as if you hadn't gotten enough training to get your education degree. So that's the problem. So how do we do it? Dysolve AI interacts with each student one-on-one through games. Why games? Because the games activate certain brain processes for the student, and Dysolve AI wants to see how the student responds. So the responses are things that give Dysolve AI information about how the brain is working for that one student. And let me tell you how Dysolve AI goes through the evaluation. Whether you call it screening or evaluation, it really doesn't matter, right? Dysolve AI is trying to find out how that brain works. One typical question that might show up in the dyslexia screener, the ones that are already out there in the market, maybe break a word like cat into a single sound, right? So it'll be k, a, t. Let's just say the student cannot produce the k, right? So that's incorrect. And a typical screener would just say, oh, it's wrong. And then the next question hops on to something completely different from that. There is no follow through. Dysolve AI doesn't do that. If k is incorrect, Dysolve AI is going to do it intelligently and ask the student to break up the word get. G, et. Why? Because k is a velar plosive. And so then try another velar sound, g. Can the student do that? Or is there a general problem with velar sounds, which are produced further back in the oral cavity? So that's how Dysolve AI will work intelligently through the whole thing, rather than hop from thing to thing and really not be able to use the results at all, because it's just very scattershot, right? So that's what Dysolve AI does. And so in a way, evaluation is no different from correction, because as it goes through, it will do it so systematically that maybe the child's brain will start to pick up, oh, there is a pattern I'm supposed to be getting. And that's what we find. There is no clear stage that is like evaluation and then intervention or correction. So that when we use Dysolve AI for very young children, say in kindergarten or first grade, the teachers and parents tell us that those students have a reading problem. But just after the evaluation, like 1 month, the problem disappears. So that means that because this evaluation is so systematic, it can start to show that brain what the patterns are in language.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I remember sitting doing those evaluations, and you're right. There would be these words that didn't even have similar. I mean, let's say like we were looking at like short vowel sounds. It would have a totally different vowel sound with the next word, and then the next one was completely different. And then I'm sitting there at the end with all these papers trying to match up where the errors are and trying to plan the instruction. That's brilliant. It just does it for you, and it builds.
Yes, and then you know how hard it is then for you as a teacher to figure out, okay, I have these little points all over the place. How am I going to connect them and then actually design my lessons to address that? They're just all over the place. You have to have a logic to it, right? And if the logic is transparent to you, then you can design the lessons to fit that.
It makes it a lot easier. I did want to talk about the specific method I had read. You have the choral method as one of the core concepts behind Dissolve. Can you talk a little bit about what that is specifically and how it really dives into the root cause of dyslexia in specific individuals?
Now we don't see the core method. That was at the beginning of what we were doing, right? It's
Mhm.
pretty much built into the AI system itself. It is the way that it operates. And, people talk about AI a lot now, but let's separate out two types of AI. You have the very generic kind of AI that you can apply to different fields, different industries. And they're talking about it when it comes to especially using language, large language models, right? But ours isn't. Dissolve AI is what now we've come to call siloed AI. It is custom built, the whole thing, the whole method, the decision making that it does, all the algorithms were designed specifically just to take care of dyslexia and all those other language processing issues. So as to how the logic works, I mean, it's just too detailed for a podcast, but I
Yeah.
think given you some sense of it by talking about the cat get example.
Mhm.
And another way, if you'd like to hear another example, it would be like some students, and you've seen that, you ask them to break a word into single sounds, they don't. They just give you the word back, right? Cat. I'm asking you for single sounds in that word, and they just say cat as a whole chunk. So then Dissolve AI will want to find out, right? So the student can't seem to have the sense of the sound unit, the phoneme, and the student is getting right away to the word. What about something in between? Not as small as sounds, not as big as words, or in this case, it's a single syllable. What about subsyllabic units, right? Onset, coda, rhyme, nucleus, those kinds of things, right? So Dissolve AI will check and test those kinds of things. So maybe that gives you a sense of how Dissolve AI works.
That really explains it well, I think, especially like in, working with families and things like that. I know there's always like the here I and it's an immediate like back up a little bit. So I think that really explained well the difference between maybe a mainstream AI tool that they hear about more
Mhm.
often or maybe they've used in their industry versus what you are doing with Dissolve. That makes a lot more sense.
Yes, and I would imagine, Katie, that moving forward, we are going to see in different fields, siloed AI like Dissolve, pretty much developed by people who have expertise in that specific field, because they need a solution that is just custom made for that field.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Just in hearing how streamlined this process could become, I wish I had had it as a teacher because that was just the biggest struggle to accommodate all the different needs and levels and figure out where students were. And the AI just helps you target that right away. And I think that's great.
And you're so young, so it's ahead of you. But yes, I do see this because I'm outside the field in a way, right? I'm not in education per se. And so when I looked at special education for the first time and I saw these big IEP reports, and then how you have to do it one-on-one with each student, you have to decide what kinds of assessments are you going to run, and then based on the results you're going to try to figure out what to do next year and how you plan all those. It is so laborious, right? It's better to actually devote all that time to instruction and working directly with the student, right? So that energy, all that effort may then be taken over by some, AI system that can just sort it out, right? Sort it out and streamline the process so that it's a lot easier. And also to be able then to take in more students who need help.
That's a big piece too, yeah, because it's so time consuming, the manual piece of it, that then you could target more students, and there's so many coming through that have a reading or language difficulty now that that's really beneficial. I wanted to ask, you had mentioned that there's gamified pieces within Dissolve for the students, so it's not just, because I have to be honest, a regular evaluation screener. I know my students were like, oh my goodness, I have to read these words again and break up the words and I have to write these. So they're like, again. So I appreciate when you said that it was more game based, correct?
It's all games. At that level of brain processing, the games are very, very short because they're trying to get to very singular processes, singular tasks, and so they're just small pieces of probes and then corrections. Yeah, they're all games.
And that's really helpful. I'm sure I taught middle school, but I've worked, around different K-12 levels in education. That seems to be a common thread among learners is that short chunk plus the gamified piece. They're engaged then while they're working independently. It's really targeting their needs. So I really appreciate how you built that opportunity, and then it personalizes it for them too, right?
Yes, there are no levels because this is all one-on-one. And what is unusual and novel about Dissolve AI, and that's why it's patented, is because Dissolve AI actually creates these games for each individual student. So you're talking about building an intervention program just for that student based on what has been found about the processing inefficiencies, where they are and the levels of severity, right? So there are no stages in that sense because it's all one-on-one. And also then, any student can come in at any age. From right now for the version we have, I say it's kindergarten on, right? But later on we can also target younger students. But Katie, I think about middle school as a sweet spot because these students have been struggling for a while. So they themselves recognize that they have a reading problem compared to their classmates. And they understand what is at stake, right? And so they may be more motivated to correct the problem. High school students, they should be using it. They still have a reading difficulty, but the problem is motivation, right? And that's why I say it is harmful to try other intervention methods if year after year you've seen that they don't work, because then you get students to the point where they lose that hope, right? They have this kind of defeatist attitude. And even when the right solution comes along, they don't take it. And that's really sad for us to see because when we do the evaluation of high school students, the problems actually have shrunk and they're very clearly defined. So it could be like a very narrow sliver of problem left that they just have to be corrected. And then it makes such a big change for the rest of their lives. But at that point, they may not take it up.
I could
Yeah.
see that. I would get them until 8th grade, and then even around the 8th grade year, they'd been with me in multisensory reading for so
Mhm.
long. Plus, they had it in elementary school. At that point, they were like, I still don't understand what I'm reading, or I still can't read it fluently, or whatever the issue may be. So I could see that being the problem with continuing a program that just isn't working
Right.
for the student.
And the cost of it too, right? I mean, let's not forget the cost. New Jersey, okay, then Dissolve is actually less than 10% of what New Jersey schools are paying right now for this problem. Less than 10% of what it costs right now. Then it can benefit not just the students with dyslexia, and bring all the others who still also have language difficulties in. In addition to that, it benefits all students, right? Because then you don't have to worry about cutting some part of the education budget just to have, this kind of service for the ones who have dyslexia, right? It's time to rethink how we should proceed with education.
I was gonna talk to you about the financial part of it because I know that is such well, education as a whole is such an expensive piece of school budgets. But I think about every time there was an issue, somebody would be like, "Let's buy this program and this program and this program," and it was a quote unquote adaptive program, but it really wasn't an adaptive program. It didn't really drill down into what the students needed. It was just pulling, standardized lessons in different orders, but it really wasn't targeting their needs.
Yeah.
So I that was one of the things I really liked when I had read Dissolve's website. I was like, this would be a really cost-effective solution, even from an evaluation standpoint, because those are so expensive.
Yeah, so you want to differentiate adaptive programs because they're not all the same, right?
Mhm.
So it's just like what you said. You can have those preset, standard kits, and then the student just moves through levels, but you don't actually get to correcting where the unique problems are. So then ours adapts, but it's one-on-one. So, it's a problem of terminology, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's what we want. We want an individualized plan, and
Yes.
Dissolve is giving you an individualized plan that actually is targeted for your students. You touched on a little bit the different age groups that go along with Dissolve, but how would you tailor it? I guess my question is more of the presentation, right? I'm assuming the presentation for a student could look different depending on if they're a kindergartner versus if they were like a 12th grader, right? Like the display and what it looks like for them as they go through it.
Let me put it this way. Dissolve AI starts probing immediately when the student first logs in, right? And as I said, Dissolve AI is going to move intelligently through until it figures out, in about 2 or 3 weeks, if the student is doing it for, say, 15 minutes a day, 3 to 5 times a week. So about 2 to 3 weeks, then Dissolve AI then generates an evaluation report showing where some of these risks are and at what levels of severity. And then from there on, then it moves into correction. Now, the look of it really doesn't matter because that's just the skin of the game, right? But every game for us is different because in terms of what Dissolve AI puts together in terms of the procedures that the students have to go through, the content, right? All sorts of vectors, like, for example, delivery speed and things like that. So they're all assembled to create a new game each time. But it doesn't mean that, you're going to see like thousands of new games because it's a lot of design work for us. So the look may be similar, right? But the games, the content, and everything else about the games, they're always new for every student, for every session. And I also want to mention, but since you mentioned presentation, we use a sea theme, water. Why? Because we have to make it very soothing, and because we realize that even when the process that's required is very simple, like, breaking up a word like cat into single sounds, a lot of the students who are struggling with language will feel very stressed or anxious, regardless of age. And that's the thing that teachers have told us about Dissolve. If they sit next to the student doing it, that, it's surprising that these students who may be in 8th grade cannot do some of these very basic things. And the teachers didn't know that, right? And then the other thing is to see these, older students feel so anxious, and we understand why, because the brain feels overwhelmed. And that's why we talk about dyslexia as processing inefficiencies, because if the brain is inefficient processing some part of language, it consumes too much energy and it's going to take away from other things, like behavior control, right? All sorts of self-regulation and things like that. And that's why you see the whole slew of behavioral issues with students who are struggling with reading.
That's a great point, and I appreciate that you brought that up, the calming aspect of the game, because, yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of game-based learning opportunities, and some of them are very even just stressful to look at just because there's so much going on top of the content, so I appreciate that yours is meant to calm them as they work on it, because that's very important, I think.
Yes, and also to recognize, right, and it's important to point it out to other teachers and parents that because of processing inefficiencies, that even little things may be too much for the child. And that's why, yes, it's a game, but we don't put in all the games and, bells and whistles, and just distract the child, because then you don't get the best performance for what we have to set as the baseline. Here's a piece of tip for, I guess, parents and teachers. If the child is already overwhelmed and is shutting down, don't ask the child, what's going on, right? What's the problem, right? Because then the child has to process that question and compose an answer. It's best to just keep quiet and let the child calm down first.
Oh, yeah, that overstimulation it can be very challenging, and so I appreciate that Dissolve is really taking that into consideration because a lot of ed tech products do not, and they're very overwhelming. So I like the calm, less anxiety inducing approach to the
You know
system.
why, Katie? Because, this is based on 30 years of field work, right?
Yeah.
Working directly with children and families. So yes, we understand what's going on externally as well as inside the brain.
Speaking of the 30 years of research, which I was very excited about, I appreciate any time something is very cemented in a long long list of research. I had seen on your website that there was a lot of different research with Dissolve. Specifically, there was like a 22 to 2024 clinical trial. There was a couple states that piloted it. So I was just curious, could you share some of the insights about that research for our listeners? And I'm going to link the links to them as well in the show notes, but just some key insights.
I'll talk a little bit about the earlier ones and then get to this ongoing current clinical trial. So at the beginning, when we first started testing Dysolve, that was in 2017. And the students who came in were primarily in middle school. So they had been struggling with, reading for a while, and they were in intervention, classes and special education classes, but nothing helped. So when they used Dysolve, within that 1 year, they went from under the 25th percentile, which is typically like the dyslexia threshold in research. They went from that, in state and standardized testing to above the 50th percentile in 1 year, right? And for some of them who had a lot of comorbid conditions and really had very severe processing issues, and it took about 1.5 to 2 years. So that was what we saw at the beginning. And so we ran these small pilot studies in New York and Pennsylvania, and then in Arizona. And for each one, it was just a small group, like under 100 participants. But we kept seeing the same kind of trajectory with the students that within 4 months, you see a change in school grades. And then later on, you see the behavioral changes. And then this big change with very external measures that we do not control, school administered state testing, right? And the regular assessments that schools run. So that's what we now always use to measure the efficacy of Dysolve. And so the 2022 clinical trial was because then the school platform was built. And so then we had the schools in 8 states, 9 states now are trying this out without our actually interacting with any of the students at all. We don't know these students. Only Dysolve AI, the computer program, is doing all that evaluation and correction, all automatically and autonomously. And guess what? It was the same trajectory that we found. And that is that, for some students, depending on the severity of the problems, they can already get up to passing after 4 months of Dysolve. The others will have to take a longer, right? Because it depends on the severity of the problems. But it's the same kind of trajectory that we've seen all along. So this clinical trial is not run by us. It is independently run by University Research Center, University of Delaware. And they are used to doing this kind of education research. So it's a randomized controlled trial, similar to what they do in medicine, right? Where you split the two groups up and then you compare the results. And they're telling us that the preliminary results, even though the trial hasn't ended, are promising, positive in favor of Dysolve. And then it shows too that the students who have been doing it longer get big gains. And so, we're waiting for them to complete the trial, right? So that's what's been shown so far. And then when we look case by case, then you can see the same kind of trajectory that, for a while you have to push and push the brain to get past its limits. And then all of a sudden the brain clicks. So it's never a gradual number for us that is always like a very sharp turn. There is a turning point when the brain clicks, and then, it's efficient after that.
I was really impressed with the research that I was reading about on your website and hearing about that too. It's clear the impact that it has. And I didn't even realize that students initially were making gains so quickly, but I think there were, did you remember seeing charts on the website, I think, to show spikes of how they were progressing over time. So that's pretty significant because I taught intervention, like I said, and I didn't see for 3 years that type of gains in reading.
Yes, Katie. So I have to tell you, because I get excited to myself when, so this book that we wrote, Dyslexia Dissolved, and it has cases in detail, stories from the parents and from the children and ourselves to explain what each one was going through. And in here, you have the first student who used the automated Dysolve platform. And he was in 3rd grade, and he went from below the 20th percentile in school regular assessment to the 50th percentile in 4 months. In 4 months. And it was the same thing that we saw now with the clinical trial for some students. It's 4 months or less. And in fact, for one group where we thought that they were going too fast, they were improving too fast, we told the teacher, don't help them. We thought that the spikes were because the teacher was helping them. The teacher said, no, they didn't happen. So somehow some of the brains changed pretty fast. All right. And now actually we have older students who have actually have not been assigned a grade level because the public school system is just waiting for them to age out. And their reading levels are so low that I guess they're not going through like state testing. Yeah, I think you're more familiar with that than I am. So we gave Dysolve to them to see if these 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds who have been struggling with reading all through their school years, can Dysolve make an impact? I'm really, really excited because this group just started. And after 1 month, right, one student who's been working diligently on it every week because he wants to actually be able to read before he leaves school, he is beginning to read. His mom is telling us now he's willing to take up a book to read. Let's just see what the scores show. But just that willingness, right, shows us that his brain has changed because it used to be so difficult, right, that he was resistant to do it. So it has to be at a stage where it becomes effortless, right? That children don't, or young adults don't resist.
That's so important because I feel like, just from my own experience, by the time they got to like high school, they're not going to make these big gains in progress on it anymore. I kept hearing that over and over again. But it's clear that they still have the opportunity to grow, especially with that up to 21 age students specifically too, because they
Yes.
need those life skills to be able to read, to get employment and things like that in the future. So, and that's great that even just the motivation piece, because I can't imagine suffering with reading difficulties for so long and then finally getting the engagement and enthusiasm and interest in wanting to read and being able to make gains so quickly. That's just impressive.
Yes, and so then maybe then this particular student can be a role model for others, right? Because, it's just going to be like a fraction of that pool who will do it, because to have that motivation and to persevere, because, it's not really fun and games. This is, really getting the correction done. That means that they have to fight through it for the brain to change, especially a 20-year-old brain, right? Has been operating in a certain way for 20 years. Dysolve has to change that. It's not going to be easy, but if they persevere, then there's this ending for them, happy ending. And we do have college students using Dysolve, and they say that it also works, right? Also keep in mind that in the clinical trial, we are taking actually the hardest groups to remediate because we have economically disadvantaged minority students. They are the majority of the participants in the clinical trial. And we're seeing the same kind of results.
That's impressive that it's pretty consistent in the results
Yes.
then across different demographics and things
Yes,
like
that's
that.
right. Different age too.
That is really interesting.
Yeah, because the computer doesn't discriminate, right? The computer treats
No, yeah, exactly.
everybody the same way.
Whereas a human would look at a piece of paper and say, "Oh my goodness, there's a student in 10th grade reading at this level. I don't think we're going to ever catch up," which I've heard over and over again from people, which is a whole nother issue. But clearly, yeah, the computer doesn't know that you're in 10th grade at this level. They're just remediating whatever
Yeah.
areas of focus you need. And that's a good point. I did want to close out with, I always like a general broad question to kind of close out, but how do you hope or envision Dissolve contributing to a broader conversation about the understanding of dyslexia or language related disabilities?
That, we hope that people realize that we now have the technology to imagine what was not possible before, peer into the brain and see what's going on, right? Because for so long, dyslexia has been confusing for a lot of people, including experts, so that there is no consensus as to how to operationalize its definition. So that if you cannot do that, then you cannot measure it. And we're saying that you don't measure dyslexia, you measure the language processing inefficiencies that are causing the dyslexia. So that now we have a very definite way to go about it, a very definite answer. And now if that's the case for dyslexia, then it's probably the case for other neurological conditions, other things that they still call disability, right? So maybe then, disability is not the right word anymore because these are conditions that can be temporary, right? And so that's the great thing about technology, especially this kind of AI, that we can actually go into the brain, peer into the brain, read the brain, and correct it, reorganize it in a very non-intrusive, gamified way. It's really, a big change. And we'll see in the coming years that other kinds of disorders or disabilities will probably get a new name.
I think what's great is that and I know from my own experience with my students that by the time they got to middle school, it was more about coping strategies to get through. And it became less of a focus on how to get the support you need to learn to read, which is a skill you're going to need for later on in life, but more of like, well, how can I just get some strategies to just push through? And I like that Dissolve's approach is really that no, you can target your areas of need and make gains to make the progress. So you don't have to learn those coping strategies because you'll get the support you need in a targeted, systematic way.
Right. And children need to know that this is finite, it's just like 1 to 2 years. If they do it consistently, it's not something that just stretches on and stretches on, like some of the old methods where if you cannot get out of the condition. Yeah, it's a big game changer. And also, I want schools to realize what it means. Cost is one. The other one is outcomes. And New Jersey especially cares a lot about student outcomes. So it is a big change when it comes to that in terms of effort, right? Everybody has been putting so much effort at schools to try to take care of the students who are identified and in, these special programs and, also then the others who can get in because resources are limited, right? And then also, we have to deal after COVID, we are dealing with teacher shortages too. So then what are we going to do about that? Also the impact of COVID on our younger students, right? They functioning less ably than the students who went before them. So now we're talking about the third graders, the fourth graders, right, Katie? And so I am very concerned about them as to how COVID impacted their language development.
I think we're starting to see some of the impacts of that. It's definitely going to be something that's going to be more necessary pretty immediately, I would say. I think we're seeing those issues pop up more and more frequently where students are coming in really struggling with the language related skills in a higher capacity than before. At least just from my own experience. I know people might be seeing things differently, but I think that's probably, if I had to venture a guess, pretty consistent across the country.
Yes, some teachers in other states are telling us that their students are not responding whatsoever when they talk to them. They're just looking at them and not responding at all. So, is that then an indication of their language ability? Yeah, this is serious. So I hope schools, do something about it because now you have solution that can be provided to students immediately, right? They don't have to wait for evaluation. They don't have to wait for intervention or correction. It's fast.
You can get them in right away. And I like that. I think the piece of you don't need extensive teacher training. I know I was trained in different strategies. For one was a full year plus
Mm.
continuing ed time over the last couple of years and a practicum. So and that's costly and time consuming. And by the time your teacher's trained, it's halfway through the year and it's like, well, now time to implement it, time to evaluate them. Then there goes another month. So I like that dissolves. It's very cost and time efficient, which is great. And I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Ho, for being here with us today and telling us all about Dissolve and all of the research and the great work being done. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks for spreading the word that dyslexia can be corrected.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Assembling Inclusion podcast. I hope the information in this episode taught you something new, gave you a new idea, or showcased a new perspective. If you liked the episode, feel free to leave us a review or comment. If you have a recommendation for an individual or an organization who would make a great guest, you can message us or send us an email at assemblinginclusion@gmail.com. See you next time.